Hi, well, first of all, thank you for agreeing to speak with us. And also, most of all, thank you for making this film. It's a wonderful film. So I wanted to start off by just asking you, where can people go if they want to recommend to others to see this film or to see your other films?
And we're working right now to make the film available for home use. We're not there yet. It's just the film's is just being released. So I can say that there is one thing that I'm very excited about is the Buddhist Film Foundation that's been really supportive of my work from the beginning, and they do the Buddhist film festivals all around the world, and they're launching a Buddhist film channel, and that will be an online TVOD platform where you choose what you want to play and you pay just for that one thing. And I think all my films will live there. And I'm really excited about that. It'll be in good company, and it'll be a great place everyone can just go to. There will be other opportunities to see the film. Of course, we'll make it available online globally, and it'll be available on Blu-ray. And there will be some screenings online too, but I can't say for sure exactly which events. But I announce these things on my Facebook page and things like that. So or you can join my mailing list if you want to get that info.
Okay, great. Well, I had a lot of questions. I'll ask a few, and if some other questions come up in the Q&A. You can use the Q&A button for the audience if you have other questions. I wanted to start, though, by asking you about just isolation. I feel like the people of the world have been studying isolation, have learned a lot about isolation in the last couple of years. Just how isolated are these hermits? And do you get any sense of how isolation has affected them?
I think it's one thing that I like to mention about the film is about the characters in the film is that though they live in remote places, and they've obviously very deliberately removed themselves to these places of solitude, they're very much connected to communities, monastic communities, and also lay communities, especially locally. There's lay communities in and around the mountains that are supporting them, oftentimes with things like a bag of rice or a jug of oil, something that they can't get or produce themselves on the mountain. People are hiking up and bringing these things to them all the time. And in the process, probably getting some great teachings and things like that. So the hermits never want to be too far away from the nearest town because they have things they need, like I just mentioned, the things that they would need. But they kind of strategically they choose areas that no one is going to stumble upon, without a lot of that, where there's not a lot of traffic. I mean, like, hikers, shepherds, so in that sense, they're physically quite removed, but they're also in a community with one another. Everyone in one, if you're living in any given valley, there's other hermits. They might be an hour walk away, or they might just be right down the hill or across the valley. And they all know each other. And if they need something, or if someone gets ill, they support one another in that sense. So they have it's sort of a scattered community there.
But they seem kind of reluctant to talk about their lives before coming out into the mountains. I don't know if that's true in general. Did you get a sense of what they were kind of trying to get away from? A few mentioned the city, some mentioned their monastic life elsewhere.
Yeah, and the distractions of visiting family.
Yeah.
Things like this. Yeah. That's definitely part of every hermit's narrative. That or any any monastic really. I did a short film called Vows about ordination, and I interviewed a lot of monks in that film, and they all told me their story. And there's this whole spectrum of how much they were sort of trying to get away from something, and or how much they were supported and sort of carried into that life, depending on their families and things. So I like to think of it not so much about getting away from something as moving into something that they've made a very deliberate choice in their life, and as part of their monastic life, to move into a space of solitude, to move into that sanctuary of solitude. And I think that way of describing it best reflects their motivations.
Yeah, that scene you mentioned from Vows was one of the most moving parts of that film, when it's the monk whose family was upset that he was becoming a monk, and sort of resisted him becoming a monk, and then meets another monk whose family was supportive of him and expresses.
Yeah, and they're sitting right next to each other. Yeah,
that was
they're friends. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, yeah. That was a really fun interview to do. Yeah, that's the case for them.
And one of my favorite parts about this film was when you ask that one monk about nature, because you have all these beautiful scenes of, the mountains in the fog and this verdant greenery. And then when you finally ask someone, what about nature, he kind of dismisses the question, or he dismisses the allure of nature. And then a little bit later on in the film, you seem to be a little bit ambivalent too, because you mix in, it's this quiet, tranquil scene, and then you mix in these ants sort of furiously tearing apart a caterpillar.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Are both you and the monks, is there kind of an ambivalence about, is it not quite as idyllic as it seems?
Well, that scene, that conversation that I had from behind the camera, which is pretty much in real time, by the way, those awkward pauses where, me thinking and behind the camera. I like that because I like that scene, not so much about as many really great teachings are or present themselves. It's not so much exactly what he's saying to me, but it's kind of what he's doing in the conversation. Very much for me. I think that he felt like I was that I wasn't seeing the plain truth of the hermit's life or the Dharma quite directly enough for him. I was trying to find all these connections. I was looking for an idea, and he just wanted to kind of say, it's somewhere, it's over here, it's somewhere else, and the practice is something different than that. And so in the film, the thing in this film that was really a driving force for me was I wanted to look at the landscapes around the hermits from my perspective as an artist and someone who admires them greatly, and also admires the classical hermit poets and hermit artists in China. That the landscapes around them very much represent their inward landscapes, their inner landscapes, and their inward journey through those landscapes. And so in the film, I make some references, like in the voiceover that you're talking about, with the close-ups of the kind of the sort of these maybe these aggressive, sort of actions like these ants kind of attacking worm and such, and the ladybug seems to be kind of scurrying away. I see that as part of a landscape that represents what we discover when we look inward, when we move inward in our practice. And so as practice deepens and we move from seeing the mountains as mountains and we go deeper into the valley, so to speak, into the depths of ourself, we discover a broad spectrum of things, and we need to be at home there and comfortable with that, and even inspired by it, because that's where the practice is happening. And I think that's kind of what he was getting at for me. He was saying, the practice happens in the practice. Maybe I was being too whimsical. Or
No, not
something.
at all. No,
I don't know. Is that whimsical? I don't know. Yeah, but yeah, it's a fun conversation. I'm really glad it's in the film, and it's a very honest moment, So, yeah.
I wanted to get to some of the questions from audience members, but first I just wanted to ask the general question of sort of where are they now? Have you followed up with any of the people you interviewed?
Sure. Yeah, there were some years there when I was living in China where I was going up into the mountains to see my Shifu like often, and even after I made the film in those years following when I was still living in China. And when I went to visit him, sometimes I would go up into the other valley. I can say I know that the older monk that has the disciples with him, the monk with the beard, has passed away. I visited with the monk, the last monk in the film, the very last hermit that we meet, who talks about Buddha nature. I have seen him a few times, and I don't know if he's still there though. The nun I know has returned to a monastery. She's living in a monastic community again, which is again, is typical. The hermits that are usually, they're in a monastery, they're practicing hard, and their teacher finally says, okay, now's the time you need to step into this new phase, and so they sort of send them off, and then they return 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. The 20 years that he spent on the mountain, that's unusual. And my Shifu is a little bit unusual too, but he has a hermitage with space, and there's other people around him. There's always 5 or 6 people. There's often 5 or 6 people there practicing and studying with him. So it's a broad spectrum of situations.
Yeah, so I think that answers one of the first questions was, are they peripatetic? Are they moving all the time? And it sounds like you're saying that you have a wide variety in how long people spend in the mountains.
Yeah. So the population is always kind of changing as hermits go up into the mountains. And I went to visit the nun from Canton. I went up to visit her, and there's somebody else there, and I just seen her there the year before. So and then shortly after that, I was in southern China, and where was I? In southern China, maybe Guangdong, and I bumped into her in a monastery. So and the monasteries are like that too. The monks want to go from one place to the other and study with different teachers and sit in different meditation halls, different chantang, and they get different practice and they get different teachings, and that's kind of the richness of that of the monastic life, as I see it. Yun Shui, right? The clouds and water, the monks are fluid. Yeah.
There was another question in the Q&A, from the Q&A button, which was, are there women hermits in the Zen tradition? Because I think it wasn't clear that you couldn't tell immediately that the one person you were interviewing was a nun.
Oh,
but there is a nun there. And were there other female hermits, or was she kind of isolated? I mean, there's such a range of age and of gender too. Were there other women up there?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely I call her the nun from Canton. because that's how she refers to herself in a sense. She says all the other hermits, when she first came to the mountain, everybody called her Guangdong, Guangdong, because she was from there, and that's really far, right? It's like far to go. It's just far away. So I think that's why everyone was keen to call her that. But in any case, the nun from Canton, she was very open and willing to be part of the project. There were many other nuns that I met, but they weren't as interested in being part of the project. So it's just part of there's a lot of nun practitioners in the mountains. There's a small hermitage similar. There's a small hermitage in that valley that's all nuns. It's maybe 6 or 7 nuns living together on a hermitage. So that, yeah, for sure.
And most of the film is you asking them questions, but I was curious whether they asked you questions. So were the hermits curious about you and what you were doing? Were they curious about kind of the outside world?
I wouldn't say they were curious about the outside world so much. They have a pretty good thumb on what's happening. They know what's happening, but because people are coming and going, bringing news and things. But did they ask me questions? Yeah, there's this term in colloquial Chinese, yuanfen, that's really it's a really important idea for Buddhists in China, right? This connection that you make with people. Oh, that's what the last hermit in the film talks about, yuanfen. You plant the seed, and then here you are standing outside my door. So that sort of weaving of karmic paths, I call it the unfolding. That's my interpretation. When you come from really the further you come away to that place from, the more sort of special that yuanfen becomes in a way, because you weren't just sort of circling around one another, and then one day you meet. You're on opposite sides of the globe, and then one day you meet. So there wasn't a lot of questions about me, but about what I was doing or whatever, but sometimes questions about my practice. And I had some lovely moments, with my teachers every day. He's so generous with his time. He spent so much time with me, especially in those early years when I was just learning things, and we would just sit in his room for hours every night and talk. Yeah. Actually, compared to shooting a film, recording a film in a monastery, the hermits were much more. I think because their practice was so advanced, they were less reactive than, say, you would get within a large community where you have people who have just ordained, who are just starting to practice, and you get a lot of kind of responses to being a foreigner with a camera. The hermits were I just sort of rolled in, and they were, and I had an introduction everywhere I went, and once we started talking about Dharma, it was, then we're kind of on the same page, and my foreignness didn't, it was just sort of a thing.
Well, one mentioned kind of, he seemed a little bit irritated. I don't know if irritated is the word, by tourists. So he made this distinction between sort of serious lay people and tourists. So it sounds like you fell into that former category, but are they bothered by tourists passing by in general?
Well, it does happen, sure. Those mountains are those mountains are public land, and people hike on the weekends there and stuff like that. And I think what he's getting at is that If you want to practice, you can stay here. But if you don't want to practice, that's not what we're about here. There's other places where you can stay in the mountains, but you're here to practice. That's it. So when you're there, yeah, you practice. You join in what's happening. I think that's his point.
One of the questions in the chat is whether they were all Buddhists or were there Taoists. And if I could tag on to that question also, are they all monastics, or were there some who were not monastics?
Some of the monks with the elder teacher with the beard were quite recently ordained, but I don't know, or they recently left home. Whether they formally received precepts or not, I wouldn't have any way. I didn't ask. That was something about Buddhism in China that I discovered much later. I didn't realize. I thought I didn't realize it was a unique process, ordination and then receiving precepts and everything. Yeah, they're all monastics in the Buddhist tradition. The monk with a beard and long hair is sometimes can throw you off because that's more of a Taoist, typically more a Taoist thing. There are a lot of Taoist hermits in that mountain range in different places. The Buddhists kind of tend to have one place and the Taoists are in another place. Some places they're both. And I did meet a lot of Taoist hermits, but I chose to focus on Buddhist practitioners because that was what I knew best.
So that touches on one of the other questions, which was there a lot of material that you cut from the film? Were there many other figures who you interviewed or talked to?
Yes, but there are interviews. There are interviews, but none of the characters that are in the film are really the characters which whose lives I was able to sort of capture in the footage with the recordings. They had the picture that I could paint of their lives is sort of well-rounded and complete, and the interviews I had with them all kind of have a flow from one to the next, and so that's why I choose them. But yeah, there's lots of other material there. Just couldn't work it into the film. One thing I filmed this film just months or probably months after I got my first camera. I was brand new to filmmaking when I gathered the first footage, and you can see it in the footage. At least I can see it. And then I went back another trip, and that footage I used to build the film around that. So the other footage, really, there's not much I could do with it. But I would like to go through and find bits of interview with the characters that didn't make it into the film, and put these online for people to watch after they've seen the film, because it's quite interesting to see the uncut interviews.
So along the same lines, what are you working on now? What's next?
I am the same question applied to my other feature film, One Mind. One Mind is a place that is at a monastery, generously, where I spent a lot of time over a 5-year period, and I gathered a lot of footage of the details of the life there. So Alms, the short film, was filmed there. One Mind was filmed there, and I'm working on another short film now that explores narratives and story in the monastic space, and how stories exist on all these kind of different levels. Like the iconography, of course, is the obvious one, and the stories behind those, and then the drum and bell sequence that begins and ends the day. These kinds of things. These are stories that the monastic space is rich with narratives that are guiding the monks in their practice. it's really an incredible thing to be able to spend time in that space. So I'm working on that. I'm also working on a film here where I'm living in Arizona right now, about landscape and identity, self, body and mind in landscape, kind of exploring that with some similar themes with the mountain path, because again, I'm looking at landscapes as an extension of our inner reality that we traverse in our practice.
Great, can't wait. In a live screening, this is the moment when we would thank you with thunderous applause instead of the awkward Zoom ending, which I still haven't mastered. But in place of the thunderous applause, just on behalf of the Ho Center and on behalf of all of our attendees, I just want to thank you again for being willing to come talk to us, and also for making the films that you've made. For at least for Chinese Buddhism, there's really nothing else like it. So thanks again.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I want to say thank you to Irene and to you, John, and to Stephanie, for putting this all together. It was really fun to share the film at the Ho Center, and yeah, I appreciate everybody putting this together. It's been a pleasure.
Right. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and see you next time. Bye now.